Alrighty, welcome to the first flip video with Ms. Jessel. This is Unit 2, Biological Basis of Behavior. And we are going to, there's several learning targets, but the main thing I want you just to know is that we're going to be talking about the neuron, the parts and functions of the neuron. We're going to talk about neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals that are in the neuron, and how they communicate with other neurons, which helps with our overall behavior and mental processes. It is following the biological perspective. What is a neuron? A neuron is an individual nerve cell. So we have billions of neurons in our body, and they communicate with each other, and all the neurons that are making up us being able to think and move and do different things, all of them are involved. It is our basic building block of the nervous system. There are several parts to an individual neuron, and they all have like a different function, which is like a purpose. We're going to go through these. So this is what an individual neuron looks like, and we're going to go through all of these different parts. I am going to show you and talk about these individual parts here with this slide, and then I am going to kind of quickly just go through the other slides that explain these parts in more detail, but I want you to go back through them yourself or slowly walk through these slides yourself. So a neuron first receives its message in the dendrites. And the dendrites are these little like branch-like structures right here that first receive the chemicals. Are actually called neurotransmitters, and they come in here to these dendrites, which are like little tree branches. And we also need to always have a cell body. The cell body is this structure here in the middle, and that is how the cell is able to function. It's the life support center. So the chemicals that come into these dendrites, it actually causes an impulse, a neural impulse along the axon. This is the axon part of the neuron. It's an actual impulse. And that impulse is going to cause the terminal branches, and we sometimes call them terminal buttons, to release a chemical that they have inside of them called neurotransmitters. And they get released to the next neuron to continue the communication. So let's go in a little more detail here. I mentioned that the dendrites, it's the first place that the message is received. The axon is so important. It's probably the most important part of the neuron. And it's where this action potential is going to take place, which is the neural impulse itself. It's also important to know that the axon has a protective covering. It's called the myelin sheath. And actually, let me go back here for a second. The myelin sheath is a fatty tissue that it's like I said, it's a protective covering. It helps speed up the transmission, the neural impulse along the axon. So people that have a deteriorating myelin sheath, or it's just not working as well, a disorder, multiple sclerosis, is actually something that can occur from that deterioration. And multiple sclerosis, where you have difficulty with movement and sometimes even thought. All right. And just also so you know that you are still developing your myelin. It doesn't fully develop until you're about 25. And they do often ask questions on the AP exam that have to do with if you have a deteriorating degenerative myelin sheath, and they sometimes even ask you specifically about multiple sclerosis. All right, so at the end of the axon, it's still part of the axon. It's called the terminal branches. And inside of them are these neurotransmitters that we're going to talk about in more detail a little later. We also need to mention that there's something called glial cells, and glial cells are really important to, the functioning and maintaining and making sure that the neurons are working well and communicating well. So they provide nutrients, they insulate the myelin, they guide the neural connections, mop up ions. So they call them worker bees. And the most important part really about the neural process, I feel, and actually I would say most agree, is this action potential, the neural impulse part, the stuff that's happening along the axon, right? So there is, when the chemicals first come in the dendrites, there needs to be this minimum threshold for the neuron to fire, which is going to create this electrical impulse, which is the action potential. So you do want to remember it's chemical when it first comes in, and then it becomes electrical. I sometimes in class do a little electrical kind of response, electrical, and that is going to cause chemicals to be released. So it's chemical, electrical, and then chemical again. All right, so we said it is an actual impulse. So when we talk about like an electrical shock or something like that, obviously it's a totally different voltage. You obviously do not feel neurons communicating in your brain and in your body because it's like millivolts. I think it's 40 to 50 millivolts for an action potential to take place. And, just to make it relative, 1,000 millivolts is 1 volt. So one thing with neurons is they are going to fire or they're not going to fire. It's called the all or none response. So just like a gun is either going to fire or it won't fire, that squeezing the trigger harder isn't going to make the bullet go faster. It can happen full response or not. Neural impulses have 2 signals. There's excitatory signals, which is going to help pass the message on, and inhibitory signals that want to stop the message. So when you have neurotransmitters that are excitatory, like I said, it's going to send the message on. So more neurons are going to be communicating. But sometimes it's important to stop a message. And I'm just going to give you a quick example of that, inhibitory. So somebody that is having seizures, if they're having seizures, they're getting too many excitatory signals when they actually need to have more inhibitory. They need to stop a message so they're not going into, having a seizure, which they have uncontrollable movements, body movements. So let's look at this one. In order for a neuron to generate an action potential, which of the following must be true? The answer is C. There has to be more excitatory impulses that must outnumber the inhibitory for the message to continue on. So neurons are not communicating at all. Sometimes they're resting. And the resting state is when the neurons are, we call it, they're polarized. So what that means is you have sodium ions on the outside. This is like the chemical process. You have the sodium ions on the outside. You have potassium ions on the inside. Now this is the axon we're talking about. And when they're resting, and we call it polarized because they're at opposite poles, opposite ends, that they're just waiting, I guess, for an action potential to take place for that threshold, the minimum threshold. And just remember, we call that being polarized. And once you get the threshold, the voltage, it's going to actually cause the ions to go in to the axon, some ions, and then some ions to go out. And we call that depolarizing the cell. All right, so just remember, when a cell is depolarizing, that means an action potential is taking place. All right, so the sodium is flooding in, the potassium is coming out, and it's going down along this axon here. So going down along the axon. All right, so you see the potassium's coming out. I sometimes will eat a chip while I'm talking about it because chips, remember the outside is sodium. Maybe you need to stop and get yourself some chips right now. You might want to go do that. But the potassium is on the inside of the chip, you know, the potato, right? So now another thing that you need to understand is that down along the axon, so almost like a domino, sodium in, potassium is going down along the axon. We also know that while that's happening, while it's going down the axon, it's actually the parts that have already received the sodium and the potassium's gone out, like as it's going down along the axon, the previous parts are repolarizing. So the previous section is repolarizing, right? So the previous sections, all right, are repolarizing, and when the action potential is taking place, it's depolarizing the cell, right? So the impulse moves down the axon like dominoes, falling one after the other. All right, so let's look at this. Sodium coming in, potassium coming out, but then after it's gone down the axon, it's going to repolarize. So one other important thing about like this action potential process is that there's this phase, we call it the refractory period, where another action potential, like another impulse, can't happen yet because it's kind of like recharging, it's resting, it's getting ready. So it says subsequent action potentials cannot occur until the axon returns to its resting state. So it's kind of like the recharging part, recharging time. 3 key terms. Polarization is the resting state. Depolarize when the action potential takes place. And repolarizing is that refractory period where it's recharging. All right, so here's one neuron. Here's another neuron that is going to receive the message. And it's going to receive the message because at the bottom here, where the terminal branches are these, there's chemicals in there that are getting released to the next neuron. We call it the receiving neuron. And those chemicals are called neurotransmitters. So we're going to look at this a little closer. This is a receiving neuron down here, and this is just an enlarged terminal branch or button, we call it. So you can see here that you have the neurotransmitters in here, all right? And when the action potential takes place, it's going to cause the neurotransmitters to be released. But notice here that the neurons, the sending neuron and the receiving neuron are not actually touching each other. There is a synapse, a synaptic gap. We sometimes call it a junction, a space here, right? But the chemicals get released and they go into the receptor sites of the receiving neuron. And notice that there's a lot of neurotransmitters here, and they're not necessarily all going to go into the receptor sites. There's going to be more neurotransmitters than there are receptor sites. So just once again, here's the tiny gap. We call it the synaptic gap or synaptic cleft. That's the space. All right. And as it's crossing the synaptic gap, it's going to, like I said, bind to the receptor sites. And remember here, you need to have more excitatory than inhibitory for the message to keep going on. Otherwise, if a lot of these are inhibitory, then it's going to stop the message. Another interesting thing, of course, I find it all interesting, but you know, that's me being the psych nerd that I am. So another thing is we have all these neurotransmitters here, and they are notice that there's more neurotransmitters than can actually go into the receptor sites. So there's something called reuptake, and some of those neurotransmitters actually go back up into the previous neuron in which they came from. We call that reuptake, it's reabsorbing. So they're reabsorbing some of those neurotransmitters. This is going to play a part in the future, especially when we talk about like certain types of drugs that are used, because some of them, will help with, because sometimes people have too much reuptake where too much is being reabsorbed and they're not getting enough of the neurotransmitter. So we'll talk about that. Let's look at this question. When there's a negative charge inside an axon and a positive charge outside of it, the neuron is, so you got the negative charge on the inside and the positive on the outside. So we would have to say that this is at the resting potential. Negative charge is on the inside and the positive charge is outside of it. It's at the resting potential. Neurotransmitters cross the blank to carry information to the next neuron. What do we call that? You're correct. The synaptic gap. That's what we call it. There are a lot of neurotransmitters, many more than what are listed here, but these are the 7 most important neurotransmitters. We are going to be doing an activity in class where we're going to actually talk about these neurotransmitters in more detail. So I'm actually going to stop the video at this point. So I'd like you to look through these, and you can look at, a little bit of the description of some of the important ones. But we will be doing this in class. So for now, go ahead and look through the rest of the slides. I hope that the neural process and understanding the neural process, I hope this video was helpful, and please stop and pause it at whatever time that you need. Okay. All right. We'll see you. It's Sunday night at like 5 o'clock. So I think it's almost time for dinner for me. All right. We'll see you.